The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer above the San Antonio International Airport Medical Clinic, and Hannah Clarke moved through them like a ghost who'd learned to pay rent. Nobody called her anything but the new contract nurse, which was exactly how she wanted it. Quiet. Forgettable. The kind of woman you'd pass in a corridor and forget before you reached the next door. She'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of disappearing in plain sight, small scrubs hanging loose on her frame, hair pulled so tight it changed the shape of her face, a limp she exaggerated just enough to seem vulnerable. The scar tissue running up both forearms, visible when she bent to take vitals, she explained away with kitchen accidents and childhood clumsiness. People believed what made them comfortable. They believed the tired woman in the 2 large scrubs was exactly what she appeared to be, unremarkable. The clinic occupied a 1,200 square foot wedge between Terminal A's baggage claim and Terminal B's rental car counter, accessible only to employees with airport credentials. 3 exam rooms, a medication dispensary, a small office with steel-framed windows, a waiting area that smelled of antiseptic, and the particular despair of travelers whose bodies had betrayed them at 35,000 feet. Hannah had been working contract shifts here for 14 months. Before that, a clinic in Corpus Christi. Before that, Dallas. She moved through Texas like water through a sieve, taking jobs that asked no questions about her background, references, or the gaps in her employment history. Contract work was beautiful that way. 23 days here, then gone. The kind of work where nobody invested enough time to become curious. Nobody invested enough time to notice anything at all. Dr. Marcus Pierce noticed. He stood in his office at 8:53 a.m. on a Tuesday, watching her through the glass partition between the main clinic and the supply room, and what he saw made a specific kind of calculation occur in his mind. Hannah wasn't taking inventory the way the previous 3 contract nurses had taken inventory: clipboard, check, move on. She was standing in the supply room with a ledger open in her left hand and a patient chart in her right, comparing numbers. Cross-referencing. Making small, precise check marks in a notebook that appeared to have nothing to do with standard hospital protocol. Her movements were economical. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Just a woman in scrubs, comparing things that should probably not be compared, at least not by someone making $14 an hour. Pierce was 52, wore suits that cost more than most people's cars, and had been padding his medical supply invoices at San Antonio International for 8 years. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity: bill insurance for treatments never rendered, medication quantities never dispensed, equipment that existed only in digital ledgers. The clinic's isolation made it perfect. The contract nurses made it possible. They came, they worked, they left. None of them asked questions about the gap between the inventory logs and the billing records. None of them cared about the patient charts that documented phantom procedures performed by phantom doctors. It had generated $847,000 in the last 3 years alone, distributed across accounts in his wife's name and a trust established through his brother-in-law's law firm. The money was the least important part, though. The money was acknowledgement. The money was proof that Marcus Pierce was clever enough to take what he wanted and leave no fingerprints. But this one. This contract nurse with the limp and the dead eyes and the military-precise way of moving through space. She was looking at things she shouldn't be looking at. Hannah felt the weight of his attention the way animals feel approaching weather. She didn't look up from her ledger. The medication inventory had been bothering her since her 3rd shift: specific discrepancies between what was logged as dispensed and what was listed on patient charts. Tylenol prescribed in quantities that didn't match dosage records. Epinephrine auto-injectors documented as used in procedures that showed no corresponding patient names. A pattern that, if you knew how to read patterns, suggested someone was creating a financial fiction and calling it truth. She'd learned to read patterns. She'd learned it in a place where patterns meant the difference between going home with all your people and going home in a flag-draped box. The notebook in her pocket was new. Unmarked. She wasn't logging findings in any official system. She was just observing. Just documenting what the numbers said when you removed the noise and listened to what they were actually telling you. Captain Hannah Clarke had been trained to gather intelligence. The fact that she was doing it in an airport clinic in San Antonio, Texas, instead of a forward operating base in Helmand Province, didn't change the fundamental skill set. Observation. Documentation. Connecting things that weren't supposed to be connected. The only difference was the stakes. Lower now. Smaller. Manageable. The way she liked it. Staff Sergeant David Morrison arrived at 10:14 a.m. in a wheelchair pushed by 2 airport EMTs, his head wrapped in a compression bandage, his uniform still holding the dust of Fort Sam Houston's training grounds. He was big in the way Rangers got big, not bodybuilder big, but the kind of broad-shouldered, dense-muscled big that came from carrying 120 pounds of gear across 40 miles of desert for 3 days straight. His left eye was slightly swollen. His jaw worked like he was clenching and unclenching it at intervals, a tell that his head was hurting in a specific way that suggested concussion, maybe intracranial pressure, definitely pain that wasn't going away with ibuprofen and ice. He'd just completed his 3rd tour in Baghdad. The intake form listed that detail in the deployment history section: 3 tours, 3 years of rotations, 3 years of something that probably didn't have a medical code. He was 28 years old with the kind of composure that came from having seen things that real civilian jobs didn't prepare you for. Hannah took his vitals without making eye contact. Blood pressure 138/88, slightly elevated. Heart rate 94, elevated. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air, normal. She moved through the assessment with the kind of efficient precision that came from muscle memory, temperature, pupil responsiveness, gross neurological function. When she asked him about the accident, he gave her the story that every soldier who'd ever hit their head on a Humvee door gives, slipped, wasn't paying attention, probably fine. He was a ranger. Rangers didn't admit weakness. They admitted nothing. They came in, got cleared, went back to work. That was the contract. Concussion protocol requires observation, Hannah said, keeping her voice at the neutral register she'd perfected over 14 months. Sleep in exam room 3. I'll check on you in 2 hours. Any nausea, vision changes, or confusion, you press the call button immediately. Morrison nodded, then winced at the movement. Smart man. That was respecting the injury enough to stop doing the thing that hurt. Hannah watched the EMTs transfer him to the clinic bed in exam room 3, her hands loose at her sides, her face revealing nothing. Before she closed the door, her fingers found the small piece of cloth sewn inside her jacket lining, 2nd Battalion, Army Rangers. The patch faded to grey from 38 months of deployment and exactly 2,847 days of living like someone who wasn't supposed to exist. She touched it once. Muscle memory. A reminder of something that was supposed to stay buried. Through the glass partition, Dr. Pierce watched the entire interaction. He watched the way she moved with this patient differently than she moved with the tourists and businessmen who cycled through the clinic. He watched the moment her hand went to her jacket. He watched the way her eyes lingered on Morrison's unit insignia for maybe half a second too long. He watched a contract nurse treat a headache case like it was something that mattered. And then he picked up his phone and made a call to a man who did discreet background investigations, the kind that didn't always show up on official paperwork. He'd hired this investigator twice before, once to confirm that a pharmacy tech was stealing medication, once to document an affair for a custody case. The man was discreet. The man was thorough. The man knew how to find things that people had tried very hard to hide. I need you to run someone, Pierce said quietly, watching Hannah document Morrison's vitals in a chart that would show up in no official system. Contract nurse named Hannah Clarke. Works airport clinic here. I need to know everything. Employment history, references, background, any gaps. Especially gaps. Call me within 24 hours. He ended the call without waiting for confirmation. The investigator didn't ask questions. The investigator just worked. And Marcus Pierce had just made a calculation that would prove significantly more consequential than any of the $847,000 he'd already taken. He'd just identified a threat. And the protocol for threats, as far as Dr. Pierce understood it, was to eliminate them before they could cause damage. Hannah Clarke was going to have to disappear again. Only this time, she wouldn't be doing it by choice. The break room at San Antonio International Airport's medical clinic smelled like burnt coffee and the particular antiseptic staleness of spaces where no windows existed. Hannah sat at the corner of the table, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had gone cold somewhere between 6:30 and 7 in the morning, watching Dr. Marcus Pierce arrange himself at the head of the table like a conductor preparing for an orchestra he'd already decided to dismantle. The TSA officers were there. Gate agents too. Junior medical staff lined the walls like extras in a film nobody had asked them to audition for. Pierce had called the meeting with precision, not an accident, not a casual briefing. An audience. Hannah recognized the setup the way a sniper recognizes sight lines. Pierce opened a patient chart with theatrical slowness. "Let's discuss questionable judgment," he said, eyes landing on Hannah with the weight of a prosecutorial gaze. "Miss Clarke here administered epinephrine yesterday to a passenger presenting with suspected anaphylaxis. Without proper authorization protocols. Without consulting operations. Without considering what that decision might cost this airport." He turned the chart so everyone could see, holding it at chest height like evidence at a trial. "Tell us, Miss Clarke, do you always practice cowboy medicine, or just when you feel like playing hero?" The room had that peculiar quiet that comes before something irreversible. Hannah's coffee sat untouched, steam long since dissipated into the recycled air. She didn't blink. Didn't move her jaw. Didn't do the things people do when they're being humiliated, the face burning, the eyes dropping, the small flinching at the edges of composure. Instead, her eyes had gone the color of old ice, the kind that forms in places where nothing warm gets through. Pierce continued. "Anaphylaxis requires authorization from a supervising physician. You know this. Every clinic employee knows this. But you decided you knew better. You decided that protocol doesn't apply to you." He let the word settle like sediment. "That's not heroism. That's insubordination. That's a liability exposure that could cost this airport hundreds of thousands of dollars in litigation." One of the TSA officers shifted his weight. One of the gate agents looked at the floor. The junior staff, 3 of them, all younger than Hannah by roughly a decade, found sudden urgent interest in the corners of the room. Hannah set down her mug with deliberate precision. The ceramic touched the table like a gavel. When she stood, the movement was slow enough that everyone's eyes tracked it, like watching something predatory unfold. Her voice came out measured, each word carved to specific dimensions, no excess material, no apology in the cadence. "The only liability here is the man who just admitted in front of witnesses that he thinks saving a life requires permission." She pushed the chair in. Not angrily. With complete calm, as if she were simply tidying a space for someone else to use. "I'm going on break." She walked out. The room exhaled, but not with relief. The silence that followed Pierce was the silence of an audience watching someone lose control of a narrative they'd carefully constructed. 2 hours later, the vending machine hummed its mechanical complaint against the corridor wall outside the medical supply closet. Hannah's hand was reaching for the coffee selection when Pierce appeared, moving with the specific intensity of a man whose initial performance hadn't landed the way he'd choreographed it. 2 junior staff members were nearby, ostensibly restocking supplies, actually watching the tableau develop with the frozen attention of people who'd learned that middle ground was the only safe place. "You're exactly the kind of liability that gets people sued," Pierce said, loud enough for peripheral witnesses to catch every word. He'd positioned himself between Hannah and the exit, a block of expensive cologne and institutional authority. "Nurses like you, always thinking you know better than the system, you're why we have lawyers. Why we have insurance premiums that make our margins impossible. Why good administrators have to spend their time managing egos instead of managing operations." Hannah retrieved her coffee. The vending machine hissed as it released the paper cup into the slot. "I could have security escort you from the premises right now. Maybe I should." Pierce stepped closer, voice dropping but not softening. "Maybe I should call someone about your credentials. Your background check. How thorough was it really, Hannah?" How much do you think I could find if I decided to look? The junior staff weren't looking anymore. Their eyes had become laser-focused on supply shelves that didn't require attention. Hannah held Pierce's gaze with the absolute composure of someone who'd weathered much worse than words. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Her voice came out like a scalpel, precisely edged. "My apologies, Dr. Pierce." She'd said it in a way that meant nothing was being apologized for. She walked past him toward the clinic floor, coffee in hand, her posture unchanged, spine straight, shoulders steady, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world knows how to offer. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close. Pierce watched her go, his jaw working, his phone already in his hand, numbers being dialed with the specific fury of a man who'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated. In the seconds after Hannah disappeared into the clinic's main corridor, he made 3 phone calls in sequence. The first to the airport authorities' legal team. The second to someone at the state medical board. The third to a private investigator whose business card had been in Pierce's wallet for exactly the kind of situations that required discretion and the kind of network that owed him favors. What Pierce didn't know was that Staff Sergeant David Morrison, currently lying in exam room 3 with a concussion assessment that didn't account for the sharp pain in his ribs and the way his breathing had become incrementally shallower over the past 2 hours, had heard every word of the break room performance. Morrison's eyes had been closed, his body positioned on the exam table like he was sleeping off the kind of head trauma that required observation, but his hearing was fine. His field awareness was fine. His ability to recognize command voice authority under pressure was absolutely fine, because you didn't survive 3 tours with the 75th Ranger Regiment without knowing the difference between someone breaking and someone who'd never break. He'd heard her response too. And he'd felt something shift in his chest cavity that had nothing to do with a fractured rib he'd been trying to ignore and everything to do with the impossible fact that the voice from a classified operation in Baghdad's green zone, the voice that had whispered "Stay down, stay quiet, we're coming," while 3 American hostages curled in the concrete darkness, had just told a hospital administrator exactly what she thought of his authority. That voice belonged to someone they'd called Shaitan. Something close to a legend. Something that didn't exist anymore, or shouldn't have. The clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed their persistent complaint. Somewhere near the gate agent station, a child cried about a missed flight. The intercom crackled with a boarding call for Houston. Hannah moved through the clinic's small pharmacy section, hands organizing antibiotic samples with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, or maybe 10,000 times in combat zones, where organization meant someone survived who wouldn't have otherwise. Her badge clipped to her scrubs read H. Clarke, RN. Nothing else. No rank. No credentials that went deeper than the civilian credentials that Cedar Creek Medical had verified through official channels. Her jacket hung in her locker, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining so carefully that no one who'd never served would recognize it, no one who'd served would ever ask about it, because you didn't ask questions about the things people kept hidden in the places closest to their hearts. What happened next didn't just change the morning. It ended something Hannah had spent 3 years building, brick by invisible brick, the architecture of disappearance, the careful construction of a life so small and unremarkable that nobody would ever think to look up its walls. Morrison's breathing had been getting worse. She'd noticed it an hour ago during a routine vitals check, his respiration rate climbing incrementally, his color shifting from normal to the particular shade of gray that meant something inside him was suffocating. Not his lungs. His heart. The pressure building in his thoracic cavity from air that shouldn't be there, blood that had no room to circulate, the slow suffocation of a body being crushed from the inside out. A tension pneumothorax doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It comes with shallow breathing and rising panic and the kind of distended neck veins that mean the vena cava is being compressed by invisible pressure. It comes with the smell of sweat and fear and the particular acrid scent of a body in acute distress. It comes, usually, with between 2 and 4 minutes before cardiac arrest becomes inevitable. Morrison was in exam room 3 when his eyes snapped open and his body went rigid. Not from pain. From the sudden understanding that something fundamental was failing inside him, that the air in his lungs wasn't enough anymore, that his heart was working against pressures it wasn't designed to resist. Hannah heard the crash, not a dramatic fall, just the sound of a man's body going rigid and the ventilator monitor screaming its alert to an empty room. She was 3 seconds from the pharmacy. She covered that distance in under 1 second flat. His skin had gone the color of wet concrete. His neck veins bulged like they were trying to escape his body. His jaw was working soundlessly, trying to pull air through a system that wasn't delivering it. GCS compromised. O2 sat probably in the 60s. Dropping. Call 911. Now, Hannah said to the junior nurse who'd frozen in the doorway. Not a request. A command. The voice had changed. Not louder, but different, the kind of different that makes people move without questioning why. Get the emergency cart. Get a bag valve mask. Move. She was already moving to the supply cabinet, already scanning for what she needed, the 14-gauge catheter, the betadine, the stuff that would take maybe 90 seconds to deploy and would be the difference between Morrison's heart continuing to beat and cardiac arrest in the next 120 seconds. Her hands found the equipment without conscious thought, because some things live in muscle memory where thinking doesn't get a vote. She counted his ribs. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Anatomy that her body knew like a song it had sung 1,000 times in places she was never supposed to have been, doing things she was never supposed to have done, saving lives that belonged to people she was never supposed to know. She prepped the site with one hand and positioned the needle with the other, and when she drove it into his chest, the hiss of air escaping the needle was like the sound of something being finally, urgently released. His color started coming back in seconds. His breathing eased. His eyes focused on her face with the specific intensity of someone seeing something that couldn't possibly exist. The crowd in the doorway had grown, travelers and staff, phones already out, already filming, already turning a medical emergency into content. Hannah didn't see them. She saw only vital signs climbing, saw the crisis tilting back toward survival, saw Morrison's pupils respond to stimuli and his heartbeat returning to something resembling normal. "You're going to be fine," she said, and meant it in a way that nobody else could have meant it with absolute certainty. "Paramedics are inbound." 3 minutes. Morrison managed 2 words. "Thank you." Hannah didn't respond. She was already calling out orders, already ensuring the paramedics would see a patient stabilized instead of a patient dying, already moving Morrison into the kind of clean handoff that made the difference between survival and the kind of death that gets reported as inevitable. It took Pierce 45 seconds to realize what had happened. It took him 90 seconds to understand that Hannah hadn't just performed emergency care, she'd performed it with the kind of precision that didn't come from certifications or classroom scenarios. It came from experience. Real experience. The kind that got classified. By the time the paramedics arrived, Pierce was already dialing the investigator again, his voice tight with something that might have been rage or might have been the specific satisfaction of having accidentally just found exactly what he'd been looking for, the proof that Hannah Clarke wasn't who her credentials said she was, which meant he finally had a weapon that would work. The monitor stopped beeping. Just stopped. Morrison's lips had turned the color of wet concrete, his chest heaving in jagged, desperate pulls that weren't pulling anything at all, no air, no oxygen, nothing but the sound of a man drowning on dry land. His eyes went wide. Panic flashed there, that primal animal recognition of suffocation. Hannah was 3 steps away when his hand clawed at his ribs. She moved. No hesitation. No moment of checking protocols or calling for backup. The muscle memory didn't ask permission. "Tension pneumothorax," she said to the empty hallway, her voice flat as a scalpel. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Now." The clinic had cleared out in seconds once people understood what they were witnessing. But the airport never really emptied, just redistributed. She could feel them in her peripheral vision. Travelers stopped mid-stride at gate 17. A TSA officer frozen with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth. 2 businessmen staring through the clinic windows like it was reality television with stakes they didn't understand yet. Morrison's breathing had become a wheeze and rattle, his skin taking on that grey-blue pallor that meant the right lung had collapsed completely, that air was trapped in his chest cavity now, compressing the heart itself, flipping the switch from wounded to dying in a space of seconds. Hannah had seen this exact shade of blue exactly 4 times in her life. 3 in Baghdad. 1 in a trauma bay she wasn't supposed to be in but walked into anyway. She didn't think about any of that. Thinking was slow. Her hands were already moving, finding the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark that mattered right now more than anything in the world. Morrison's ribs were sharp under her fingers, easy to count. Easy to locate. The precision moved through her like electricity following a circuit that had been burned into her nervous system so completely it didn't require her brain anymore. The needle went in. The hiss came out. Air. Months of training and seconds of reality compressed into one sound, that rush of pressure releasing, that specific exhalation of trapped atmosphere escaping from where it had no business being. Morrison's body went rigid for 1 heartbeat, 2, and then his shoulders dropped. His breathing changed. Shallow still, but moving. Actual exchange. Actual oxygen molecules threading back into alveoli that had been collapsed like deflated balloons. "You're okay," Hannah said, keeping her voice in the register that didn't ask for permission, just stated facts. Needle decompressed the right hemithorax. "You're breathing again. Stay with me." The color started coming back to his face. Pink leaked under the gray like watercolor touching wet paper. His eyes found hers, not confused anymore, not drowning. Alert. Present. Alive. "What?" Morrison's voice came out like gravel in a blender. "How did you?" "Don't talk." O2 sat climbing. "We need to move you to Cedar Creek now. Emergency transport." She was already reaching for the radio before he finished the question, already calling the ambulance that was probably 4 minutes out, already deciding what Morrison needed to know and what he needed to find out later, if there was a later, if Pierce didn't burn the entire building down before the paramedics got here. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Pierce standing in the doorway. Not attacking yet. Just watching. His face had transformed into something she'd never seen on him before, a shade of red that looked like it had been photoshopped into reality, like actual human skin couldn't hold that much color without rupturing. His hands were clenched so tight at his sides that she could see the tremor in his knuckles from across the room. Hannah didn't look at him directly. Direct eye contact with Pierce was something people learned to regret. Instead, she watched the monitor stabilize. Watched Morrison's oxygen saturation climb, 72. 78, 84. 89. Watched the man she'd just saved start breathing like he belonged in the world again instead of at its exit gate. "I need those paramedics now," she said into the radio. Her voice sounded like it came from someone else, someone steady, someone who wasn't currently being destroyed by the man standing silently in a doorway that suddenly felt like a frame around his entire future going up in smoke. The paramedics came. Of course they did. They were always faster than people expected at San Antonio International. The airport kept a station on the premises, 2 minutes from anywhere to anywhere. They came with a stretcher and questions, the routine script of emergency medicine that people recited without thinking because thinking got people killed. "What are we looking at?" The lead paramedic was a woman named Reeves, maybe 30, with a kind of professional calm that meant she'd seen worse. Most people hadn't. Most people never would. "Tension pneumothorax from undetected rib fracture," Hannah said. "Needle decompression at second intercostal space, right side. O2 sat was 68 when I performed the procedure. Now 89 and stable. He needs a chest tube at Cedar Creek and imaging to rule out cardiac trauma." Reeves blinked. Not a long blink, but long enough that Hannah understood it. Long enough that she knew Reeves had just recalibrated her entire assessment of the situation. A nurse didn't talk like that unless a nurse had been places. A nurse didn't move like that unless a nurse had already seen the worst humanity could do and decided to keep working anyway. "Your transport," Hannah said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. Cedar Creek Level 1. Priority alert. Tell them we're bringing attention pneumo with successful decompression, stable vitals, ETA 12 minutes. Reeves nodded once. Professional nod. No questions. Just competent recognizing competence across the space where most people only ever saw job titles and duty assignments. They moved Morrison to the stretcher. Hannah's hand stayed on his shoulder for the transfer, not a gesture of comfort, though maybe it was that too. A gesture of connection. A moment that said, I see you. I know you. You're going to make it because I won't accept any alternative. The weight of that unspoken contract moved between them like electricity through copper wire. You saved my life, Morrison said. His voice was clearer now. Stronger. The trauma was already receding, replaced by the specific gratitude of people who'd been 2 minutes away from death and now weren't. I did my job, Hannah said. Stay still. Don't move. Paramedics have you from here. She stepped back. The stretcher wheeled out. Reeves called back over her shoulder, good work in there. Then it was quiet. Just Hannah and the monitor still beeping its normal rhythm, and Pierce still standing in the doorway, and the travelers still watching through the windows with the expressions of people who'd just watched something they were never supposed to see in public. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. His jaw worked like he was chewing gravel. His phone was already in his hand. She could see his index finger moving, the practice motion of a man who solved problems by calling people who owed him favors. Hannah turned back to the exam table. Started cleaning blood from the surface with meticulous attention, each swipe of the sanitizing cloth a small decision to remain professional, remain calm, remain the person who'd just saved a man's life in front of everyone instead of becoming the person who'd just made herself disposable. She could feel Pierce's eyes on her back. Could feel him calculating. Could feel the moment he understood that she wasn't going to apologize. Wasn't going to explain herself. Wasn't going to pretend that saving a life required permission from people whose job was to make sure the paperwork was signed before anyone got to live. What the hell were you thinking? His voice came out strangled. Not loud. Worse than loud. The kind of quiet that meant he was already on the phone with lawyers, already drafting the termination notice, already erasing her from the system the same way she'd been erased from so many other systems before this one. Hannah didn't turn around. Just kept cleaning. Just kept moving. Just kept being exactly who she had always been, the kind of person who makes hard choices when the moment arrives and deals with the consequences afterward. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper. Something that had been seared into her nervous system in places that didn't exist on any map, by people who didn't exist in any file. Something that recognized the weight of a human life and never, ever put a form in front of saving it. That decision was going to cost her everything. But Morrison was breathing. And right now, that was all that mattered. Marcus Webb didn't hesitate. The moment Hannah left the exam room, he was moving back to his office, door closing hard enough that his secretary flinched, phone already pressed to his ear. 3 calls. That's what it took to weaponize the system against her. Legal team at the airport authority first. The woman who answered knew his voice before he finished introducing himself. We have a situation, he said, not a question, not a request. Just a statement of fact, the way someone who'd spent 20 years cultivating power learned to speak. A nurse, he explained, had administered emergency medication without proper authorization protocols, had bypassed chain of command, had put passengers at risk with her reckless judgment. By the time he finished the sentence, the legal team was already taking notes. 40 minutes. That's how long it took for the first formal complaint to land on the airport authority's desk. The words were careful, clinical, designed by attorneys who knew how to bury people in bureaucracy. Liability exposure. Scope of practice violation. Potential criminal negligence in the administration of controlled substances. But Webb wasn't finished. The second call went to the Texas State Medical Board in Austin. He didn't use his name this time, didn't need to. "I'm calling on behalf of the San Antonio International Airport Authority," he said, voice smooth as oil on water. "We have a contracted nurse, Hannah Clarke, who's demonstrating a pattern of practicing beyond her credentials. Administering epinephrine without physician authorization. Performing emergency procedures without licensure." The board investigator on duty took his statement with the tone of someone who'd heard similar complaints 100 times, but Webb's voice carried weight. He sounded official, institutional, credible. He provided dates. Specific incidents. He even mentioned that the nurse had been confrontational with supervisory staff, which technically wasn't a lie, just a creative reimagining of her refusal to acknowledge his humiliation. The complaint was filed before he hung up. By 2:08 p.m., the state board had opened a preliminary investigation into Hannah Clarke's nursing license. The third call was the real weapon. Webb kept a private investigator on retainer, a man named Valdez who specialized in situations requiring discretion, which meant he could access databases most people didn't know existed, could call favors owed by board members and city officials, could make questions appear in the right ears without anyone quite remembering who asked. "I need background on someone," Webb said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Comprehensive. Deep. Hannah Clarke works at San Antonio International Airport Medical Clinic. Contracted nurse. I need to know everything." Valdez was used to these calls. "Timeline?" he asked. "Yesterday," Webb said. "End of business." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Valdez understood. He had 3 contacts at the airport authority, 2 at the city police department, and 1 at the county clerk's office who owed him favors that went back years. "I'll have something for you by tonight," he said. Webb heard the clicking of keyboard keys already starting. Good. The wheels were turning now, gravity in motion, an institutional force that couldn't be stopped once it started moving downward. Security found Hannah at 3:15 p.m., still in her clinic shift with 30 minutes remaining. A supervisor in a grey polo shirt appeared at the medical records room where she was finishing charting, and his face told her everything. She didn't ask questions. Didn't protest. Just followed him down the hallway to the administrative office where her badge was waiting on a desk, sitting there like evidence. "Your clinic access has been revoked," the supervisor said, his voice apologetic but formal. "Effective immediately. We're going to need your badge and your keys." Hannah set them on the table. Her fingers were steady, but she could feel the weight of the moment. The sound of her access card clinking against the desk sounded like a door closing somewhere deep inside her. "Is there anything you want to say?" the supervisor asked, and she could hear the discomfort in his voice, the way people sounded when they knew something was wrong but couldn't say it out loud. "No," Hannah said. "I understand." She didn't understand, not really. Didn't know about the 3 phone calls, the state board complaint, the investigator already digging through databases trying to find her. All she knew was that she'd saved a life and somehow that had become a crime. The supervisor cleared his throat. Dr. Pierce indicated there may be further action. "Legal action." "I'm sorry." She wasn't. That's what she understood. Webb wasn't sorry either. Valdez started making calls at 4:22 p.m. First to Hannah's previous employers, the temporary staffing agency that had placed her at Cedar Creek Medical 6 months ago in Phoenix, the urgent care facility in Albuquerque before that, the 2 emergency rooms in Colorado where she'd worked under different names, different contracts, always temporary, always moving. "I'm looking for employment history," Valdez said to each person. Background verification on Hannah Clarke. What he got back was consistent, excellent evaluations, no complaints, spotless record. But that was the problem, wasn't it? The record was too clean. No references from military service. No education history before nursing school. No family contacts. Nothing before the last 5 years. It was like watching someone materialize out of nothing, which meant someone had erased her from something. Valdez knew what that looked like. He'd seen it before: witness protection cases, relocation programs, classified military discharges. He pulled the thread harder, started calling contacts at DFAS, the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, the place where military records lived. Got transferred 4 times. Got told to stop asking questions. Got a very official conversation with someone from a Pentagon legal office who said, "I can't discuss this individual," which was exactly the kind of statement that meant there was something classified worth discussing. The door was locked. But locked doors were proof that something valuable was being kept behind them. Hannah drove past the airport without stopping. Just kept heading west on I-10, the highway stretching empty in the late afternoon heat, her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel like she was driving through a war zone. The clinic was behind her. Her badge was behind her. The future that had been almost believable for 3 years was folding up like paper in rain. She kept driving until she found a diner off an exit she didn't recognize, fluorescent lights buzzing like angry hornets in the parking lot, the kind of place where nobody asked questions because nobody cared. She sat in a booth at 3:08 a.m., third night she'd been coming here, third night sitting in the same spot, watching her coffee go cold while a trucker in the corner booth read yesterday's newspaper and pretended she didn't exist. Her phone had 17 missed calls. State Board. Pierce's attorney. A number she didn't recognize that had called 6 times. Her landlord, who'd apparently received some kind of inquiry about her. Questions being asked in databases, in offices, in places where official questions meant official trouble. She turned the phone off around midnight. Turned it back on at 2 in the morning. 17 calls waiting like bombs. She stared at her reflection in a dark window, a woman with steady hands and empty eyes, someone whose greatest skill had become staying invisible. Outside, an 18-wheeler pulled away from the pumps, red taillights fading into the darkness of the desert highway, heading somewhere else, somewhere better. She thought about that. Thought about driving. Thought about not stopping. She thought about her son in Baghdad. Lieutenant Andrew Morrison, 75th Ranger Regiment. She hadn't spoken his name out loud in 3 years, hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't done anything except touch the faded patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with his unit insignia, the Ranger's motto. Rangers lead the way. She'd left that war so he could come home to a mother. She'd buried her service record, her rank, her entire identity, to give him a chance at a normal life. And the moment she'd actually saved someone, the moment her training had kicked in and her hands had moved on their own and a man's chest cavity had inflated and his oxygen levels had climbed from 68 back toward normal, everything had fallen apart. The coffee was cold. The reflection in the window was cold. Hannah Clarke was cold, sitting in a fluorescent-lit diner at 3 in the morning, wondering if disappearing was supposed to feel this much like dying. She reached for her jacket, found the patch, felt the embroidered Ranger's insignia under her fingertips. Her son was alive. That was what mattered. That was what she'd always told herself. He was alive and safe and she was invisible, and that was the trade. That was the cost of redemption. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow. Didn't know that an Iraqi man would wheel through the airport clinic in the morning, former Republican guard, clutching his chest in panic. Didn't know that security had been ordered to keep her off the premises, which meant she'd have to choose, break the only rule she'd followed in 3 years, or let another person die. Didn't know that her choice would shatter every carefully constructed lie, would bring Rangers walking toward her in dress uniforms, would bring officers out of the crowd with citations she'd never been allowed to claim. Didn't know that the man she'd saved 2 days ago was still waiting in the airport terminal, grateful and alive, carrying a story about his sister that would change everything. All she knew was the cold coffee. The dark window. The reflection of a woman who'd held too many lives in her hands and lost them all the same. Behind her, the trucker paid his bill and walked out. The diner was empty now except for the waitress, who was pretending not to watch Hannah sit motionless in the corner booth, staring at nothing. 3 hours until dawn. 3 hours until the next crisis would pull her back into the light. The EMT wheeled him through the clinic doors at 6:51 a.m., and everything Hannah had spent 3 years burying surfaced in a single moment of recognition. The man was thin, chest heaving, his hand clawed over his sternum. Maybe 60. Maybe younger, Pain and fear aged men differently than kindness did. He spoke in fragmented English between gasps, something about his heart, something about pressure, but his eyes found Hannah's face and locked there like a targeting system. His mouth opened. One word escaped, whispered with the kind of terror that only came from seeing a ghost materialize in the waking world. Shaitan. The ghost. The American shadow who materialized in their strongholds and vanished with their prisoners. His fingers trembled against his chest, and Hannah's entire system went quiet, that tactical quiet that came from training, the kind of calm that felt like holding your breath underwater for hours. She moved him to exam room 2 without changing her expression, without acknowledging what she'd just heard. EKG leads. Troponin draw. For access at the antecubital fossa. Her hands moved with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this in sandstorms under fire, and the fragile man watched her work with tears streaming down his face, whispering in Arabic, mercy, forgiveness, prayers she understood perfectly but had trained herself to forget. The room smelled like fear and antiseptic and diesel fuel still clinging to his clothes. Pain was information. Fear was data. She ignored both and read his vitals like they were written in her first language. BP elevated but stable. Troponin pending. The man was having a panic attack triggered by recognition, not a myocardial infarction, but she didn't explain that yet. Let him breathe. Let him understand that the ghost he'd named in whispers had become someone who healed instead of extracted. That was its own kind of mercy. The clinic doors opened again at 7:03 a.m., and Staff Sergeant David Morrison walked in wearing jeans and a Fort Sam Houston PT shirt, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose ribs still sent electric shocks through his nervous system when he pushed too hard. Released from the hospital. Cleared for light duty. He'd come to thank the nurse who'd saved his life, to do the thing soldiers were trained to do, acknowledge your debts in person, look people in the eyes, say the words. His trajectory took him toward the reception desk and then stopped. His entire body went rigid. Not from pain. From recognition. From the exact moment his neural pathways matched the face he'd seen in a classified Pentagon briefing 3 years ago, a briefing about the operation in Baghdad's Green Zone, the one where a captain had pulled 3 American hostages from a building under direct orders to stand down, the one where she'd simply disappeared afterward, erased from the service record, the reason he was alive. His eyes narrowed. His shoulders squared. His hand moved to his back pocket where he kept it, where he'd carried it since the extraction, a citation on official Pentagon letterhead, folded and refolded 1,000 times, the paper soft as fabric from constant handling. He crossed to Hannah with the gait of someone moving through water, each step deliberate and controlled, and he pulled out that citation with hands that weren't quite steady. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of classification and 3 years of carrying gratitude with nowhere to put it. Captain Hannah Clarke, he read aloud, his words loud enough that other staff turned to listen. Army Rangers. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Baghdad, when she single-handedly extracted 3 American hostages under sustained enemy fire despite direct orders to abort. The waiting room had gone dead silent. The fluorescent light seemed to hum louder in the absence of sound, and Hannah's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough that someone trained to read human tells would notice the tremor wasn't fear, it was restraint, the kind of control that came from having already survived the worst thing that could happen. She didn't speak. Let Morrison finish. Let the truth spill into the fluorescent-lit room like blood into clear water, spreading and unstoppable. 2 silver stars. Purple Heart. And a recommendation for a Navy Cross that never made it to official channels because this operation never officially happened. The citation trembled in his hands. Dr. Marcus Pierce burst through the clinic doors at 7:06 a.m. like a man whose entire carefully constructed world had just developed hairline fractures. He'd gotten the call from Valdez 40 minutes earlier, the Pentagon attorney, the classified asset alert, the withdrawal of charges, the sudden and absolute collapse of every strategic advantage he'd spent 2 weeks assembling. His face was the color of uncooked meat, his voice a weapon being fired at close range. Fraud. Impersonation. Identity falsification. He was shouting now, pointing at Hannah while his eyes darted to Morrison, to the citation, to to the watching staff, to the watching patients, calculating angles that no longer existed. "You're harboring a fugitive. I'm calling federal law enforcement right now." His hand moved to his phone, but a voice stopped him, calm, measured, the kind of voice that came from having given orders to men with assault rifles who would follow those orders into hell. "Don't." A man in marine dress blue stood in the clinic doorway, and the rank insignia caught the fluorescent light like a promise kept. Colonel Michael Graves, attaché to CENTCOM, stationed at Gate 17, waiting for connections that apparently involved picking up loose threads. He'd received the alert the moment Captain Clarke's name had appeared in a federal database query, and he'd cleared his entire schedule to walk the 10 minutes to this clinic. His voice was precision itself. "Dr. Pierce, is it?" The captain was operating under Pentagon authority. "She remains under Pentagon authority. You, on the other hand, are operating under investigation." The colonel pulled papers from a leather portfolio, and his words cut through the room like a field thoracotomy with a combat knife, surgical, deliberate, final. "Orders from the Joint Chiefs. Presidential classification. Your interference with a classified operative constitutes a federal offense." Pierce's phone fell. Actually fell. Dropped from fingers that had gone numb and clattered against the tile floor with a sound like a gunshot fired in church. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in exam room 1 cycling its mechanical breath. Pierce's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, and Hannah watched him with the same neutral expression she'd worn while saving his life hours earlier: professional distance, clinical detachment, the kindness of people who understood that courage wasn't required to be competent. Morrison was staring at her now, eyes moving across her face like he was reading classified documents, seeing the captain underneath the scrubs, underneath the 3 years of disappearing into the background of a terminal clinic. The Iraqi man in exam room 2 began to pray, his voice soft and trembling, and Hannah felt the weight of 3 lives converging: the man she'd saved in Baghdad, the ranger she'd just extracted from a tension pneumothorax, the son she'd raised in classified silence. The truth wasn't supposed to arrive all at once, but it was here now, moving through the airport clinic like shrapnel settling into skin, impossible to remove, impossible to ignore. Valdez's report arrived at 2:15 p.m., delivered in person to Dr. Pierce's office where he sat with his attorney and a personal crisis that no legal representation could resolve. The investigator laid out documentation with the care of someone disarming a bomb, each page another count, another charge, another nail in a coffin that was now so thoroughly secured it would hold for decades. 18 months of inflated medical supply orders. Phantom patient treatments. Insurance claims for procedures never performed. Medications requisitioned but never dispensed, the inventory flowing like river water through accounts controlled by one man, one signature, one systematic theft that totaled $847,000 across multiple carriers. "The nurse," Valdez said, and his voice carried the particular tone of someone who'd discovered he'd been hunting a ghost while standing next to her. She wasn't hiding anything. She was documenting everything. Every discrepancy. Every inconsistency. She was building a case against you while you were trying to build one against her. Pierce's hands had started to shake. Actually shake. His attorney read the report once, then a second time, then looked at his client like he'd just realized he was being asked to defend a man who'd confessed to a crime while pointing a gun at his own temple. "You need to retain different counsel," the attorney said quietly. "I can't represent someone who's this exposed. You need to speak to federal prosecutors about a plea agreement before they decide to add other charges." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the state medical board had reopened Hannah's complaint file and closed Pierce's investigation into her conduct. By 5 o'clock, he'd been suspended pending criminal investigation. By week's end, he was terminated. By month's end, facing fraud charges. His medical license under review. His mortgage payments bouncing. His wife filing for separation because the bank account was empty and the future was darker than any night he'd ever imagined. The airport clinic staff watched him clear his office without saying a word, not one person acknowledging his exit, not one colleague offering help or condolence or even the basic courtesy of eye contact. He'd spent years terrorizing people who couldn't fight back, and the moment someone appeared who could, the moment institutional power met actual consequence, he'd collapsed like a house built on quicksand. 6 months later, a medical supply van pulled into the delivery dock at San Antonio International Airport, and the man driving it wore a company polo shirt with the pharmacy chain's logo embroidered on the chest. He was thinner than he'd been, grayer, moving with the careful steps of someone whose joints had started storing regret like calcium deposits. He wheeled boxes past the clinic entrance, bandages, saline, syringes, the supplies that kept the medical operation running, and through the glass doors he could see her, the nurse, training a new staff member on proper documentation procedures, her voice steady and clear, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone born to this work. She didn't look up. He didn't go in. The past had already collected enough interest, and there was no currency that could pay what he owed. He made his delivery and drove back to the warehouse where his supervisor, a former corporal who recognized a man in freefall and had hired him out of something between mercy and entertainment, would direct him to his next route. This was what penance looked like when the legal system was generous. This was what consequence felt like when you'd spent your entire career avoiding it. He was free, technically, and the freedom tasted exactly like the expensive coffee he could no longer afford. Hannah stood in Terminal B, watching her son step off the plane from Germany with Staff Sergeant Morrison beside him. 3 years had passed since she'd held Tyler in her arms, 3 years of classified separation, 3 years of being invisible in her own life because the operation in Baghdad had been too politically sensitive for official acknowledgement, the extraction too inconvenient for public record, the captain too dangerous to let exist in any official capacity. But her service record had been quietly restored to active reserve status 2 weeks after Marcus Pierce's office was cleared. Her clearance reactivated. Her name UN erased from the systems that had buried her. Morrison had requested Tyler's transfer personally, same unit, same battalion, same rangers that Hannah had commanded before the operation that wasn't supposed to happen. Her son wore the faded unit patch on his shoulder, the same patch she'd sewn into her jacket lining, the patch that had stayed with her through 3 years of appearing in crime scene photos and surveillance footage and background checks she shouldn't have survived. He saw her in her clinic scrubs and crossed the terminal with the gait of a young soldier who'd inherited his mother's composure and his own reasons to understand what it meant to sacrifice visibility for safety. He didn't salute. He hugged her while travelers navigated around them, a reunion 3 years delayed by classification levels and political burials and the cost of doing the right thing when ordered not to. Morrison stood apart, giving them the space that family required, his eyes moving across Hannah's face with the particular gratitude of a man whose life she'd saved twice, once in Baghdad, once at the airport clinic. The flowers arrived 15 minutes later, delivered by an older Iraqi man with his nephew, the young man from Michigan whose uncle's life Hannah had saved at the airport, whose family in Baghdad owed her 3 people they'd thought were lost forever. They brought tears and thanks in 2 languages, and the clinic staff who'd gathered to watch, the new operations director, the junior nurses who'd been trained by a woman they now understood had been a ranger captain, stood in respectful silence while Hannah held flowers and accepted gratitude from men she'd pulled from burning buildings. She touched her son's face and saw the same scars she carried, the same understanding in his eyes. Saw that he'd survived whatever deployment had shaped him, and that her 3 years of disappearing had given him 3 years to breathe without the weight of her legend, 3 years to become himself instead of living in the shadow of her choices. The new operations director, a former Air Force medic named Cameron, approached with a quiet smile. "You're exactly the kind of person we need making decisions," he said. "Whatever you want, the position is yours." Hannah didn't answer immediately. She stood in the terminal with her son holding her hand and Morrison beside her and flowers from men she'd saved, and she understood that the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Not through silence, but through the weight of showing up. Through the willingness to act when others froze. Through the simple, devastating courage of choosing to heal instead of hide. As Tyler's connection to Fort had boarded, as he kissed his mother goodbye and carried his ranger patch into the next operation, Hannah watched him go. Not invisible anymore. Not erased. Just a nurse with a classified past, a medical degree earned in fire, and hands steady enough to hold whatever broke in front of her. The terminal continued its rhythm around her, announcements, rolling luggage, the constant motion of people in transit, and she moved back toward the clinic, toward the next patient, toward the ordinary work of extraordinary people doing quiet things that mattered. Make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes who change everything without asking for credit. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value? Because the world needs to hear those stories.